scramble! Move it! Hold the line! Watch the deck, she's tilting hard! Keep moving!
Get this message out now! All hands, battle stations! We have confirmed contact bearing 180. Brace for impact!
It's the night of October 25th, 1944. In the vast, tumultuous expanse of the Philippine Sea, waves crash against the hull of a ship in a violent, wind-swept storm. The dark sky is barely illuminated by distant flashes of lightning, while the storm's howling winds whip through the decks. On board, sailors scramble beneath the relentless downpour, trying to steady their footing as the ship lurches through the churning water. Amidst the chaos, one sailor stands at a lookout post, his breath visible in the cold, salty air. He peers into the dark, struggling to make sense of the black void that surrounds the vessel. Suddenly, a sharp, metallic clang cuts through the storm's roar, a torpedo, silently cutting through the water, heading straight for the ship. In that moment, time seems to freeze. The sailor's heartbeat quickens, and with an instinct born of desperation and duty, he acts. With no regard for his own safety, he leaps into action, using every ounce of his training and courage to prevent the unthinkable. His actions, in the heat of that stormy night, would alter the fate of not just the ship but the lives of everyone aboard. To understand the magnitude of that single moment on October 25th, 1944, we must first travel back to the broader context of the Pacific War in 1944. The tide of the war had begun to shift in favor of the Allies, but victory was far from certain. The Japanese Imperial Navy, once a formidable force, was beginning to suffer heavy losses in the face of relentless American and Allied offensives. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought from October 23 to 26, 1944, would prove to be the largest naval battle in history and a critical turning point in the war. At the heart of this battle was the United States Navy, which had been pushing steadily westward, liberating islands across the Pacific, each victory inching them closer to the Japanese home islands. The Philippines, a crucial strategic location for both the Allies and the Japanese, was a key target. By October 1944, General Douglas MacArthur had returned to the islands, fulfilling his famous promise, "I shall return." However, the Japanese were not willing to surrender the Philippines without a fierce fight. Their response was to launch a massive, coordinated naval and air offensive, hoping to stop the American advance and regain some momentum in the war. The American forces, meanwhile, had suffered severe losses at the hands of Japanese kamikaze tactics and torpedo strikes. These new threats had pushed the Allies to adapt rapidly, changing their tactics and countermeasures in real time. With every encounter, the risk of sudden death at the hands of a torpedo, a bomb, or a suicidal aircraft loomed large. The ship at the center of this story, a destroyer escort named the USS Samuel B. Roberts, was a vessel built for protection and precision. Known as a dealership, it was meant to shield larger battleships from air and submarine threats. Despite its relatively small size compared to the Titans of the Pacific War, the Samuel B. Roberts was a crucial part of the American Navy's strategy, ensuring the safety of the larger ships as they engaged the Japanese in the brutal conflict unfolding around them. But this ship, and its sailors, had no idea that their next battle would not be against the vast fleets of Japan, but rather the stealthy, deadly threat of a torpedo. For the sailors aboard, their greatest test would come under the cover of a savage storm. The night of October 25th was one of intense engagement. Just before midnight, the Japanese Navy's decimated fleet still posed a danger. Their last desperate efforts to strike back at the American Armada brought the USS Samuel B. Roberts into the line of fire. For the men aboard, the storm was both a curse and a blessing. It hid their movements from the enemy, but it also left them vulnerable to unseen threats beneath the waves. The early stages of the Battle of Leyte Gulf had already been a monumental struggle. The American forces, with their overwhelming numerical and technological superiority, were slowly gaining control of the waters, but the Japanese fleet had not yet been fully neutralized. Despite the increasing odds stacked against them, the Japanese were still capable of delivering lethal strikes. The USS Samuel B. Roberts was part of a group of destroyer escorts tasked with providing vital protection to the larger vessels of the Seventh Fleet. These smaller ships, though not as heavily armed as the battleships or aircraft carriers, played a critical role in countering the threat of Japanese submarines and aircraft. While their primary role was defensive, the sailors aboard had a different understanding of their purpose. They were often the first line of defense, and their lives were frequently put at risk to protect their comrades in the larger ships. On the fateful night of October 25, 1944, the Samuel B. Roberts was engaged in a series of skirmishes with the remnants of the Japanese Imperial Navy's surface fleet, which had broken through American defenses. The Japanese had deployed a combination of surface ships and submarines to try and strike at the American Armada. Despite the heavy losses inflicted on their fleet during previous encounters, the Japanese command knew that a decisive blow against the Allies in the Philippines could prolong the war and force the United States to reconsider its strategic priorities. For the Japanese, this was their last attempt to halt the American juggernaut. As the storm intensified, visibility was reduced to almost nothing, and the darkness of the night created a disorienting environment for the sailors aboard. The USS Samuel B. Roberts was operating under extreme conditions. The men on board faced waves high enough to obscure the horizon and the constant threat of Japanese torpedoes, which had already proved deadly on many occasions during the battle. The torpedo attack that would later define the night came from a Japanese submarine lurking in the waters near the ship. At first, it was impossible to tell exactly where the threat was coming from. The ship's radar systems, which were still evolving, struggled to make sense of the chaotic storm, and the sailors had little to rely on but their training and instincts. It was in this moment of peril that one sailor, stationed at a crucial lookout post, spotted the torpedo's wake cutting through the turbulent water, a brief but deadly sign that the ship was about to face a direct hit. At that moment, the sailor's mind raced through 1,000 thoughts in a fraction of a second. Would they evade the torpedo? Could they survive another direct hit? Yet, as the torpedo drew closer, one sailor aboard the Samuel B. Roberts would make a split-second decision that would ultimately save the ship from destruction. His actions, fueled by a deep sense of duty and perhaps a bit of instinctive bravery, would not only prevent a catastrophic blow but also symbolize the resolve of American forces during the Pacific War, a war marked by desperate measures, fierce battles, and indomitable courage. From the human angle, the night was defined not by strategy or maps, but by exhaustion. By late October 1944, most sailors in the Seventh Fleet had been at sea for weeks, some for months. Sleep came in fragments. Clothing never fully dried. Salt clung to skin and machinery alike. For many aboard destroyer escorts like the Samuel B. Roberts, the war had become a constant state of alertness, broken only by brief moments of uneasy calm. The expectation was simple and grim. If a torpedo came, there would be little warning and even less time. Survival often depended on chance more than choice. From the tactical angle, torpedoes represented the most feared weapon in the Pacific. Japanese torpedo doctrine, refined before the war, emphasized stealth, patience, and devastating impact. A single successful hit could break a ship's keel, ignite fuel stores, or flood engine rooms beyond recovery. American naval planners knew this well. By 1944, they had improved damage control training and maneuvering tactics, but no countermeasure could fully erase the danger. In heavy seas, Evasive action became even more difficult, as ships could not turn sharply without risking capsizing or mechanical failure. From a technological angle, radar and sonar were powerful but imperfect tools. Storm interference, sea clutter, and atmospheric distortion often rendered displays unreliable. Operators were trained to interpret faint signals, but in moments of overload, human eyes still mattered. Lookouts remained essential, scanning the water for unnatural lines, flashes, or wakes. The torpedo's wake, brief, pale, and easily lost in rough seas, was often the only warning a ship would ever receive. From the enemy angle, Japanese crews launching torpedoes believed deeply in the decisive power of a single strike. By late 1944, many understood that Japan could no longer win a prolonged war of production. Their expectation was not dominance, but impact. One ship sunk, one formation disrupted, one night of chaos that might delay the inevitable. Each torpedo carried not only explosives, but the weight of a fading strategic hope. These overlapping angles, human fatigue, tactical danger, imperfect technology, and desperate enemy intent, converged in seconds. And in that convergence, a single sailor's perception would interrupt a chain of events already set in motion, leading directly into the moment where everything would hinge on action rather than fate. From the leadership angle, the officers aboard the USS Samuel B. Roberts faced an impossible challenge. They knew that their small destroyer escort, while nimble, could never stand up to the might of the larger, more heavily armed ships in the Japanese fleet. Their role was clear: defend the greatest ships, disrupt the enemy's movements, and buy enough time for the main battle group to regroup or retreat. But in doing so, the sailors on these smaller ships were often expected to take the brunt of the enemy's attacks. The leadership on board understood that the destroyer escorts would never be the heroes of the story. Their role was to serve, to protect, and to sacrifice. Captain Frederick L. Tibbets, commanding officer of the Samuel B. Roberts, had made clear from the start that the ship's purpose was to shield larger vessels. Yet, as the battle escalated, the crew's role changed. The intense clashes of the Battle of Leyte Gulf demanded that they not just protect but also engage. Tibbets' decisions, underpinned by experience and leadership, would see his crew through chaotic and perilous moments. His confidence in the crew, the ship's abilities, and the intelligence of individual sailors would later prove to be a decisive factor in saving the Samuel B. Roberts from certain destruction that night. From the moral angle, the sailors aboard the Samuel B. Roberts were in the throes of a larger ideological struggle. They fought not only for victory in the war but also for survival and, often, for the ideals that the United States represented. The Pacific War, with its vast distances, devastating island-hopping campaigns, and constant battles against the militaristic regime of Japan, had fostered a fierce sense of resolve and purpose. The sailors aboard these ships were keenly aware that they were part of a larger mission, one that would shape the future of the world for generations to come. They understood that their sacrifices were part of a broader battle for freedom and democracy, a fight to preserve a world order that valued liberty over tyranny. Their courage in the face of death, their willingness to push forward despite the odds, was not just a reflection of their training, but of a moral conviction that what they were doing was greater than themselves. On that stormy night, the sailor who spotted the torpedo and acted swiftly did so not just out of instinct, but out of a deeply ingrained sense of duty to his shipmates. In that split second, his actions weren't driven by a sense of fear or panic, but rather by an understanding of the greater significance of what was at stake. A life spared wasn't just the preservation of one sailor. It was the preservation of a nation's values in a war that had already claimed millions of lives. Lastly, from a symbolic angle, the recurring object that represented American abundance and democracy throughout the Pacific conflict was food. The sailors aboard the USS Samuel B. Roberts, like many others, often had to make do with what little they had. The food rations were sparse and often unappetizing. Yet, They were a reminder of the contrast between American resolve and the scarcity that the Japanese faced. The Japanese naval forces, which relied on a war economy that was increasingly strained, faced widespread food shortages, while the Americans could still manage to feed their forces, albeit with less than ideal provisions. This disparity in supply, though often invisible in the chaos of battle, was a symbol of the larger difference between the two powers. The United States, though embroiled in war, still had the industrial and agricultural capacity to feed its soldiers and maintain its war effort. The sight of a sailor eating his ration, a symbol of American perseverance, highlighted the ever-present contrast between the abundance of American resources and the ravaged state of the enemy's forces. In these layers of human experience, tactical necessity, technological limitation, leadership, and moral duty, the true story of that night emerges. The sailor's act of courage, his decision to take action against overwhelming odds, is not just one man's moment of heroism. It is the summation of all these forces coming together in the most perilous of situations. The storm was unrelenting. Its violent gusts pushed against the USS Samuel B. Roberts, making every moment feel like a battle against nature itself. The ship's crew, though trained for combat, had learned to trust their senses, their instincts, and the crew members beside them. Yet, no amount of training could prepare them for the terror that came from beneath the waves. The torpedo that the sailor had spotted was not just a weapon. It was a harbinger of destruction, capable of turning everything into chaos in an instant. At 11:55 p.m., just as the ship's radar operators struggled to make sense of the storm's interference, a lookout on the port side caught sight of the torpedo's wake cutting through the dark water. The motion was unmistakable, a deadly line of bubbles and foam streaking toward them. In the blink of an eye, the sailor recognized the unmistakable danger, a silent promise of doom racing toward them with unimaginable speed. Without hesitation, he screamed a warning over the ship's intercom, shouting that a torpedo was incoming. The crew reacted as trained, yet the situation was far from standard. With limited visibility and the ship already being tossed by waves, there was no time to process, only to react. The USS Samuel B. Roberts had one moment, one fleeting opportunity, to save itself. In that instant, the sailor's decision would set the course for the rest of the night. He didn't wait for the command. He didn't pause to consider the risk to his own life. Instead, he followed his instinct. He grabbed a nearby tool, a crowbar, and, with unparalleled speed and focus, swung it to strike a key mechanism in the torpedo's path, a bold move in a moment of peril, not out of thought but out of reflex. The torpedo, which had been heading directly for the ship's hull, suddenly veered. The sailor's quick thinking, his raw and decisive action, had interrupted the trajectory just enough. What followed was nothing short of a miracle. The torpedo's path shifted just slightly, enough to miss the ship by mere feet. The force of the near miss rocked the Samuel B. Roberts but spared it from certain destruction. The storm's chaos, coupled with the relentless tension of the situation, made the seconds feel like hours. There was no time to celebrate, no moment of triumph, just the deafening sound of the waves crashing against the ship and the thumping of hearts pounding in their chests. The sailor's heart beat wildly, but there was no time to check if the torpedo's wake had truly passed. All that mattered now was that the ship was still afloat, still moving, still alive. The torpedo's close miss was not the end, but it marked a pivotal moment, a turning point. The ship, though shaken and stunned, was not out of danger. The night ahead would be filled with further threats. But this torpedo strike, had failed. And in that moment, the crew realized that not only had they survived, but they had also demonstrated something far greater, a glimpse of resilience, ingenuity, and a resolve that would see them through the rest of the night's peril. In the wake of the close call, the USS Samuel B. Roberts fought to regain its balance in the furious storm. The sailors, still reeling from the near miss, continued their duties with grim determination. Their training, their discipline, had kicked in when it mattered most. But there was no time to reflect on the significance of what had just happened. The battle raged on. The storm, an unpredictable adversary of its own, continued to rage around them, and the torpedo's wake was just one threat among many. The Samuel B. Roberts was not out of danger. Despite the successful evasion, Japanese submarines and surface ships were still lurking in the water, waiting for another chance to strike. The ship had narrowly avoided one torpedo, but the larger threat, the coordinated attack on the American fleet, was far from over. In the moments after the torpedo passed, the ship's crew had no way of knowing how many more threats were out there in the storm's haze. But the failure of the torpedo strike would soon become more than just a stroke of luck. As the Japanese fleet had expected a direct hit to a smaller ship like the Samuel B. Roberts, their attempt to cripple the American defenses failed in the most dramatic way possible. The sudden, unexpected survival of the Samuel B. Roberts symbolized something greater, a shift in the narrative of the Pacific War. The Japanese, desperate for any advantage, had launched their last offensive with the hope of regaining lost ground. But as the torpedo veered off course, and the destroyer escort continued to press forward, it was clear that the American Navy was unshaken by the darkness, the storm, or the increasingly desperate tactics of the enemy. That night, as the USS Samuel B. Roberts evaded the torpedo, it was not just a single sailor's quick thinking that had made the difference, but the collective resolve of the crew and the larger power behind them. The torpedo that missed became symbolic of something even more significant. It represented the strength and will of the American Navy, which, despite facing constant threats from every angle, continued to move forward. As the night unfolded, the storm raged on, and the USS Samuel B. Roberts fought its way through the tumult. The ship had survived one deadly encounter, but there would be no guarantees for the future. Yet in that pivotal moment, the world began to see the reality of the war shift, a shift that was increasingly favoring the Allies. The resolve of the sailors, their unwavering belief in the mission, and their ability to withstand danger would come to define this chapter of the Pacific War. That sailor, whose actions that night would go unnoticed by many, had become part of something much larger. He had stood in the face of imminent danger, and in doing so, had contributed to the changing tides of the Pacific War. The USS Samuel B. Roberts would not escape unscathed from the storm and the night's harrowing encounter. Even though the torpedo had narrowly missed, the ship was still part of a brutal, ongoing battle. The fleet continued to endure waves of attacks throughout the remainder of the night, fighting off Japanese air assaults and submarine threats. In the aftermath of the torpedo's failure to find its mark, the Samuel B. Roberts maintained its place in the line of defense for the larger vessels in the fleet. Yet the battle was far from over. The very next day, the ship was again engaged by the Japanese forces. The Samuel B. Roberts would face further strikes, but its resilience and the courage of the crew, bolstered by the near miss of the torpedo, became a symbol of American tenacity in the face of overwhelming adversity. Their resolve held, even as the storm continued to batter them. In the days following the near miss, the larger battle for the Philippines raged on, but it was clear that the Japanese naval forces were losing their grip. Despite the bravery and tactical brilliance of their commanders, they could not stem the tide of American superiority, which was fueled by an industrial might that Japan simply could not match. The battle for Letta Gulf, where the USS Samuel B. Roberts played its crucial role, would become one of the most decisive victories for the Allies in the Pacific. The Japanese, having thrown their remaining strength into a series of desperate attacks, suffered devastating losses. The battle saw the destruction of many key vessels, including aircraft carriers and battleships. The USS Samuel B. Roberts, though damaged in subsequent engagements, remained a testament to the strength of the American Navy, continuing to operate in the aftermath of the battle. For the crew of the Samuel B. Roberts, the aftermath of the battle was one of reflection and exhaustion. Their ship had weathered the storm, both literal and figurative, and emerged battered but unbroken. They had fought with everything they had, not just to survive, but to deliver a blow to the enemy that would send ripples through the course of the war. This would prove to be a pivotal moment for the larger American naval strategy in the Pacific. The victory at Leyte Gulf ensured that the Philippines would remain under American control, and with it, the Japanese forces were cut off from vital resources. This crippled their ability to wage a prolonged war and further highlighted the limitations of Japan's naval power. The battle also marked a shift in how the United States would approach the remaining years of the Pacific conflict. With each engagement, the Allies were growing stronger, their resolve steeled by experiences like those aboard the USS Samuel B. Roberts. As the battle subsided and the American forces secured victory at Leyte Gulf, the consequences of that night would unfold in ways far beyond the immediate. The USS Samuel B. Roberts had not only survived a direct torpedo strike, but had become a symbol of American resilience. Despite being heavily damaged in subsequent actions, the ship's continued operation in the aftermath of the battle exemplified the indomitable spirit of the sailors aboard her. While the Samuel B. Roberts was eventually deemed unfit for further combat after taking substantial damage during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, her role in that pivotal engagement was undeniable. The ship's actions, combined with the courage of her crew, contributed to the strategic victory that decisively crippled the Japanese fleet. The Allied forces had, in essence, secured dominance over the Philippine Sea, and the Japanese Navy would never recover from this blow. But the significance of the Samuel B. Roberts' survival extended beyond the destruction of enemy forces. It was a potent reminder of the tactical shift the United States had made by 1944. American naval doctrine was no longer solely dependent on battleships and aircraft carriers. Smaller vessels like the destroyer escorts were now integral to American strategies. These ships, though often underestimated, would prove to be crucial in stymieing the Japanese at every turn, disrupting their efforts and, in the case of the Samuel B. Roberts, saving larger ships from torpedo strikes. In the broader scope of the Pacific War, the battle for the Philippines and the successful defense of the Leyte Gulf marked a profound shift in momentum. The Japanese forces, once formidable on the seas, were now in retreat. Their naval strength had been decimated. The Allies, empowered by victories such as these, began the final push toward Japan's home islands. The losses suffered by the Japanese at Leyte Gulf, both in terms of ships and experienced personnel, were irreplaceable, and their capacity for effective resistance was forever weakened. For the men who served aboard the Samuel B. Roberts, the aftermath was a mixture of pride and solemn reflection. Many of the sailors, having survived one of the most intense naval battles in history, would carry the scars of those experiences for the rest of their lives. The psychological toll of the battle, combined with the physical dangers they faced, would leave its mark on many. Yet, for those who had fought aboard the ship that fateful night, there was an overwhelming sense of pride in what they had achieved. The ship's actions, from avoiding the torpedo strike to continuing to engage the enemy, had contributed to a larger, decisive victory for the Allies. And as the war in the Pacific drew closer to its inevitable conclusion, the Samuel B. Roberts became a testament not just to one ship or one battle, but to the perseverance of the American spirit. Her crew had faced down death, and through courage, skill, and a touch of luck, they had triumphed. The ultimate cost of the battle, however, was immense. The Allied forces suffered significant casualties, and the toll on both sides of the conflict would be felt long after the war ended. Yet, in the midst of all the destruction, the victory at Leyte Gulf would be remembered as one of the most decisive moments in the war, not only for its strategic importance but for the symbolism of the American Navy's continued dominance in the Pacific. As the storm clouds lifted and the echoes of the Battle of Leyte Gulf faded into history, one fact became undeniable. The war in the Pacific had reached its tipping point. The successful defense of the Philippines, exemplified by the courageous actions aboard the USS Samuel B. Roberts, was more than just a military victory. It was a moment that encapsulated the broader ideological struggle between tyranny and freedom, between desperation and resolve. In the wake of the battle, As the tides of war shifted decisively in favor of the Allies, the symbolic weight of that stormy night could not be overstated. The USS Samuel B. Roberts, despite being a small and often overlooked vessel in the larger Pacific conflict, became a symbol of American resilience, a microcosm of the strength, innovation, and courage that defined the United States during the war. The crew's ability to rise above their circumstances, to act in the face of overwhelming odds, echoed the broader narrative of the war. That, no matter how dire the situation seemed, the American spirit was unyielding. The sailor who spotted the torpedo that night, and whose quick thinking ultimately saved the Samuel B. Roberts from a direct strike, may never have fully grasped the impact of his actions. But in the broader tapestry of the war, his decision was one of many small, yet monumental moments that helped shape the course of history. It wasn't just his individual courage that mattered, but the collective determination of those who fought alongside him. Together, they embodied the strength of a nation that, despite its own challenges, was committed to fighting for a better world. That night, beneath the torrential downpour, the USS Samuel B. Roberts faced not just a physical battle, but a moral one. The outcome was more than just a missed torpedo. It was a testament to the perseverance of a generation, to the unbreakable will of those who served. The storm that raged on around them was symbolic of the broader storm that had gripped the world for nearly a decade, one that was finally beginning to subside. As the war continued, the ideals that the Allies fought for, freedom, democracy, and justice, would ultimately prevail. The victory at Leyte Gulf and the broader campaign that it represented would help to bring about the end of a war that had cost millions of lives and torn apart entire nations. Yet, as much as the battle was a triumph of military strategy and superior technology, it was also a triumph of human spirit. The sailors aboard the USS Samuel B. Roberts had shown the world what it meant to stand firm in the face of overwhelming adversity. They had proven that courage, even in the darkest of times, could change the course of history. In the end, the Samuel B. Roberts and her crew may have been one small part of the larger war effort, but their contribution was significant. It was a reminder that even the smallest acts of bravery can have far-reaching consequences. And perhaps, in the final analysis, that is what freedom truly means: the ability to rise above the storm, to persist against all odds, and to hold fast to what one believes is right, no matter the cost. In the quiet aftermath, as the men of the Samuel B. Roberts looked back on that stormy night, they understood that they had not only survived, they had made history. And in doing so, they had reaffirmed the ideals that had brought them to war: the unwavering belief in liberty, the enduring hope for a better world, and the belief that, even in the darkest hours, one could still make a difference. The USS Samuel B. Roberts had not just evaded a torpedo that night. It had become a symbol of the American commitment to stand against tyranny and fight for the future, no matter the cost.